Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The frontier was quiet in a way that made every sound feel sharper. Elias Ward rode slowly along the ridgeline, studying the empty land ahead. Dry grass shifted in uneven patches, and a long, abandoned homestead sat alone near a cluster of pines. From a distance, it looked deserted. Broken fence posts leaning outward, windows dark, roof sagging in the center. Nothing about it suggested life. Elias pulled his horse to a stop and stayed still, listening. He was used to silence. He had spent the past year drifting from place to place after leaving a ranching job in Wyoming, trying to outrun a mistake that had cost a man his life. The accident replayed in his mind at unpredictable moments, especially when the land grew too quiet. He traveled south now, not for work or gold or any promise of fortune. He simply wanted a place where he could breathe without remembering every detail. His mission was straightforward: keep moving, stay unnoticed, survive the winter. He scanned the homestead once more. Something bothered him. The place looked abandoned, but a thin, steady trail of smoke rose from the crooked chimney. Smoke meant warmth. Warmth meant someone was living here. He felt a low tension tighten his shoulders. If someone's home, they might think I'm trouble, he thought. If no one's home, something's wrong. The sky behind him darkened as heavy storm clouds began to build. Riding past a homestead in weather like that could get him trapped miles from shelter. He hated the idea of approaching a stranger's door uninvited, but he knew enough about frontier storms to respect them. He nudged his horse forward. As he neared the yard, the homestead revealed more details: an axe left in a stump, a wash basin set on a bench, boot prints near the door. The property might have been damaged by time, but it wasn't abandoned. Someone had been working hard to keep it alive. Elias dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible. His nerves tightened into a controlled alertness. He had seen the wrong kind of welcome before, guns raised before questions asked. The door opened without warning. A woman stepped out. She was dressed in a plain buckskin shawl and a long, earth-colored skirt. Her dark hair was braided, and her expression was guarded but steady. She did not step back, but she did not step forward either. She measured him the way someone measures danger. Elias recognized the signs immediately: loss, caution, and a readiness to defend herself if needed. Ayoka, though he did not yet know her name, had lived through more than the empty yard suggested. She was an Apache widow who had buried her husband the previous winter after a fever took him. Since then, she had remained alone on the land they had fought to keep. Her mission was survival, day by day, chore by chore, while staying far enough from the towns that distrusted her people. Every decision she made was shaped by the memory of danger and the need to protect what little she had left. She held the doorframe lightly, but Elias saw her other hand near her waist, close to a hidden knife. She was not afraid. She was prepared. "What do you want?" Her voice was low, steady. Elias lifted his hands a little higher. "Storm's moving in. I won't stay long. Just need a dry place to wait it out." Her eyes narrowed. She wasn't convinced. He understood her hesitation. A lone man at her door meant risk. He glanced at the broken fence, the scattered woodpile, the cracked window frame. The place needed repairs badly. He imagined she had been trying to hold everything together on her own. The thought pulled at him, quiet, simple empathy he couldn't quite ignore. "I'm not here for trouble," he added quietly. "If you want me gone after the rain stops, I'll go." He saw her thinking it through. She studied his clothes, his exhausted posture, the careful way he spoke. She was searching for signs of lies or aggression. Her expression revealed nothing, but her shoulders eased the slightest bit. "You can stay under the porch roof," she said. "Not inside." "That's enough," Elias replied. The decision relieved him more than he wanted to admit. The ache in his chest, the tension in his jaw, both loosened as he led his horse under the shelter. Ayoka stayed at the doorway, watching him with the steady focus of someone who had learned to expect danger. Elias respected that. He kept his movements slow and deliberate. As the first drops of rain tapped the porch roof, Elias felt the familiar contrast of safety and unease. He was grateful for shelter, yet aware this woman owed him nothing. Her presence sharpened his thoughts. She's alone out here, long enough that everything around her is falling apart. The idea stayed with him, heavier than the rain. Ayoka closed the door halfway, but not completely. A sign she wanted distance, not hostility. The storm thickened. The land blurred. Elias leaned against a post, trying to settle the unease inside him. He knew he shouldn't stay near people. Staying meant forming attachments, and attachments led to choices he wasn't sure he could make again. But something about the quiet figure inside the cabin made him stop moving on. She, in turn, wondered why a man who carried so much tension in his shoulders spoke with such calm restraint. His presence felt unpredictable, but not dangerous. Still, she kept her guard high. She had survived too much to trust easily. The storm intensified, forcing them into an uneasy proximity. Two strangers bound by circumstance, each carrying separate burdens, each with missions that defined their every move. Elias searching for a place where he could outrun his past. Ayoka fighting to hold on to what remained of her life. Neither could guess that this single night at a broken homestead would begin something that would change everything they knew about staying, choosing, and surviving. Rain pressed hard against the porch roof as Elias shifted his weight, listening to the storm settle thick around the homestead. Inside the cabin, Ayoka moved quietly, the sounds faint but steady, wood being stacked near the stove, a pot being set down, the careful routine of someone who lived alone and kept every action measured. The door remained cracked, not enough to invite him in, but enough to show she was aware he might still need help if the storm worsened. A gust of wind pushed cold air through the boards, and Elias tightened his coat. The place needed repairs far beyond what one person could manage. The roof sagged dangerously, and sections of the fence had rotted through. The land around the cabin looked like it had fought against too many seasons without enough hands. He wondered how long she had been carrying all of it by herself. A dull thud came from the side of the house. Elias stepped off the porch and found the woodpile collapsing, soaked through by the heavy rain. The support beam beneath it had snapped. He crouched, studying the break, already calculating what could be salvaged. He didn't want to seem intrusive, but leaving it the way it was meant the firewood would be useless by morning. Before he could start lifting the fallen pieces, the cabin door opened wider. Ayoka stood in the light of the doorway, the shadows behind her moving with the warmth of the fire. She hesitated, then stepped out far enough to see what he was doing. "That beam has been weak since last winter," she said, her voice firm yet low. "I plan to fix it when the weather cleared." Elias nodded and continued assessing the damage. "The wood's still good. Just needs a dry place and something solid to lean against. I can get it off the ground if you want." She didn't answer immediately. She studied him the way she had earlier, searching for motive, weighing risk. Her eyes held a mixture of fatigue and guarded resolve, the kind that formed after months of carrying every responsibility alone. "Do what you think is best," she said at last. "But stay where I can see you." Elias accepted the boundary without question. He stacked the wood beneath the porch roof, moving slowly so she could watch every action. The storm soaked through his shirt, but the work steadied him. Tasks like this had structure. He understood structure. Ayoka retreated to the doorway again, the firelight outlining her silhouette. She crossed her arms against the cold, though her posture stayed sharp. Elias didn't mind the scrutiny. Out here, caution kept people alive. When he finished, she glanced at the newly supported pile, her expression shifting just slightly, something like relief, though she hid it quickly. "You didn't have to help," she said. "I know." He wiped the rain from his brow. "But it needed doing." She held his gaze for a brief moment before turning back inside. After a few seconds, she opened the door wider and moved aside. "The storm won't stop soon," she said. "If you stay on the porch, you'll get sick." Elias stepped just inside the threshold, careful not to cross further than she allowed. The cabin felt warm, lit by a modest fire and the soft glow of oil lamps. The air held the scent of pine smoke and stew simmering in a pot. Everything inside was organized with precision. Tools hung neatly, blankets folded tightly, traps stacked in a corner. It was a small space, but but it carried the impression of someone who fought to maintain order. Ayoka gestured to a stool near the wall. You can sit there. Don't touch anything else. I won't, he answered. She returned to stirring the stew, though her eyes flicked toward him more often than she intended. She was trying to decide whether he posed a threat. Elias understood that unspoken tension. He felt it too. A stranger in a small shelter during a storm forced people to reveal pieces of themselves they normally kept hidden. He cleared his throat lightly. How long have you been out here alone? The question wasn't meant to pry. It came from something more basic, recognition of the strain in her movements and the exhaustion she kept contained. She paused before responding, long enough to know what this land demands. Her answer was honest, but it carried weight. It also told him what he needed to know. She had been managing everything without help. Roof beams, broken fences, gathering wood, hunting for food, defending the property. No one lived this far out by choice unless they were avoiding something or had nowhere else to go. The stew began to bubble. She lowered the heat and served herself a small portion. Elias didn't expect a bowl. He knew better than to assume hospitality from someone who had every reason to distrust outsiders. But then, without turning to look at him, she set a second bowl on the table. Eat before it cools, she said. Elias studied the gesture. It wasn't friendliness. It was a practical decision. Someone cold and hungry in her shelter would be a problem if he weakened. Still, it softened something inside him. He sat at the table, but waited until she lifted her spoon before he touched his. The storm continued outside, the wind pushing against the windows with sharp, uneven pressure. Ayoka finally spoke again. Where are you going? Elias stared at the steam rising from his bowl. The truth was simple, even if it felt unfinished. Nowhere in particular. Just passing through. She watched him closely. People don't ride into storms unless something is behind them. He met her eyes, appreciating the directness. Then maybe I was tired of riding away from it. She didn't push further, but the remark shifted the air between them. Her shoulders relaxed the smallest amount, as if hearing someone speak plainly made him easier to read. When they finished eating, she gathered the bowls and placed them in a basin. The gesture was efficient, not rushed. Elias remained seated, aware she was evaluating everything. His posture, his silence, the way he handled himself in her space. He could feel her trying to decide how long this uneasy arrangement could last. The fire cracked softly. The storm rumbled overhead. And without either of them acknowledging it, something had begun to shift, small, practical, steady. A line of understanding forming between two people who knew how to survive, but not how to trust. The night deepened, and Ayoka finally nodded toward a blanket near the wall. You can sleep there. Keep your boots where I can see them. Elias laid the blanket out, careful with every movement. As he settled down, exhaustion hit him harder than expected. He hadn't slept indoors in weeks. Ayoka extinguished one lamp and sat by the fire, sewing something with precise, practiced hands. She didn't speak again. She simply worked, keeping him in her peripheral vision. Elias closed his eyes, listening to the storm fade into a steady rhythm. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to rest. Not because he felt safe, but because for this one night, survival didn't depend solely on him. Without fully realizing it, he had stepped into the beginning of something that felt less temporary than he intended. The land outside was harsh, isolated, unpredictable, but inside the cabin the tension carried a different shape, one he didn't know how to name yet, but one that made him stay awake longer than he meant to, thinking about the woman who guarded this place like it was the last piece of her life she could still protect. The fire had burned low by the time the storm reached its heaviest point. Wind forced itself through every gap in the walls, and the cabin creaked under the pressure. Elias opened his eyes slowly, unsure of how long he had slept. The air inside had grown colder, and Ayoka was no longer seated near the flames. He pushed himself upright, listening. A faint sound came from the back corner of the house, wood straining, a buckle giving way. Elias stood quietly, not wanting to startle her, and stepped closer to the room where the noise repeated in short, uneven bursts. Ayoka was there, bracing her shoulder against a heavy storage chest that had shifted with the movement of the storm. One of its legs had splintered, and the weight pressed dangerously toward the wall. If it fell completely, it would crush the clay jars stacked beneath it. "Let me help," Elias said, keeping his voice calm. She startled at his presence, but didn't argue. The strain in her arms showed she had been holding the weight longer than she should have. Elias stepped in, lifted the chest enough to pull it back into place, and wedged a solid piece of wood beneath the broken leg. The simplicity of the task relieved him. Physical work always steadied his nerves. Ayoka caught her breath, her expression tight, with a frustration that wasn't aimed at him. "This cabin shifts every time the wind changes. I've been trying to reinforce it, but there's too much to do alone." Her honesty surprised him. She had guarded her words so carefully before, but exhaustion pushed past restraint. "You've held it together longer than most could," Elias said. She didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders eased. They stood in silence until another loud crack came from near the door. Elias moved quickly and found the inner support beam leaning under the stress of the wind. The damage looked old, worsened by months of weather. He realized she must have wondered how much longer the place could endure another season like this. He examined the beam and tightened a rope around it, using 2 chairs to brace it upright. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it kept the structure stable for now. Ayoka watched him work, her expression unreadable. She seemed to be studying not what he did, but the calm, methodical way he did it. A person who came with malicious intent wouldn't bother reinforcing someone else's walls in the middle of a storm. "You've done this kind of work before?" she asked. "Most of my life," he replied. "Ranches, line shacks, bunkhouses. Enough places where a broken beam meant trouble." Her eyes lingered on him, thoughtful, as though weighing whether to ask more. She didn't. Instead, she reached for a lantern and hooked it onto a nail to brighten the small room. The storm roared again, louder this time. The shutters rattled violently, and Elias crossed the room to secure them. She joined him, pushing one into place while he locked the other. Their hands brushed briefly. Both pulled back, but neither of them looked away. Ayoka stepped back toward the fire, adding wood and coaxing the flames into a steady burn. She moved with quiet determination, as if forcing the room to stay warm would keep the storm from taking anything else. Elias stayed near the window, checking for other weak points. He didn't want to intrude on her home, but he couldn't ignore the instinct to secure whatever he could. "You take care of this place alone," he said. She kept her focus on the fire. "There is no one else. My husband built it. I try to keep it standing." The statement carried a restrained heaviness, but her face held steady. Elias realized that she was not just protecting a home. She was protecting the last piece of her life that had not been taken from her. For a moment, the storm quieted. A strange stillness filled the cabin, the kind that settled after long tension. Ayoka sat down near the fire, the light casting sharp angles across her face. Elias returned to the stool she had allowed him earlier, careful to maintain the space she needed. Yet the atmosphere was different from before, less rigid, shaped by the necessity of working side by side. After a while, she spoke again. "Why are you truly traveling alone?" Elias expected the question eventually. He considered his answer carefully. She wasn't searching for gossip or a story. She wanted to understand the man who had ended up on her land during a storm strong enough to keep him captive. "I left my last job after an accident," he said. "A man died. It wasn't intentional, but it was my fault. I couldn't stay there after that." Ayoka listened without shifting her gaze. She didn't interrupt or judge, only absorbed the information with the same steadiness she used to face everything else in her life. "Running won't change it," she said. "I know," he answered. His voice held a tired truth, and that honesty struck her more than the details of what he had done. The fire settled into a steady burn, warming the cabin. Ayoka laid out another blanket near the wall, a quiet acknowledgement that he would remain inside for the rest of the night. Elias accepted it, though a part of him felt the weight of staying anywhere longer than he intended. As he settled down again, he noticed Ayoka checking the corners of the cabin, shutters, storage chests, the patched beam, as if ensuring everything would survive until morning. Her movements were careful, but not fearful. She carried the tension of someone who had learned to expect difficulty and deal with it as it came. Before returning to her own bed, she looked at Elias one more time. Her eyes held the same guarded caution, but there was something else beneath it, an acknowledgement that his presence had kept the cabin standing tonight. She extinguished the lantern. The room dimmed, but not completely. The fire left enough light for both of them to see one another's outlines in the darkness. Outside, the storm finally began to break. Inside, the uneasy boundary between them had shifted in a quiet, unspoken way, shaped by shared work, unguarded answers, and the realization that surviving the night had required both of them. The storm finally eased by morning, leaving the air cold enough for breath to show in front of the mouth. Elias opened his eyes to the faint crackling of the fire and the muted creak of floorboards as Ayoka moved around the cabin. She was already dressed, already working, already rebuilding the order that the night had threatened to break. He sat up slowly. His muscles felt stiff from sleeping on the floor, but the warmth of the room helped. Ayoka glanced toward him for only a second before returning to tying bundles of dried herbs. Her expression held the same guarded composure, but the tension from the previous night had thinned. She had accepted his presence, at least for now. "You should eat before you leave," she said. Her tone was neither welcoming nor dismissive. It was practical. Elias didn't correct her assumption. Leaving was the logical thing to do. Yet something in his chest tightened at the thought. He stood, folded the blanket neatly, and approached the small table without a word. She set down a bowl of stew, thicker than last night's, and retrieved another for herself. They ate quietly, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Elias noticed how carefully she handled everything. Her movements were deliberate, not out of delicacy, but necessity. She used only what she needed, wasted nothing, and stayed alert to every sound from outside. He realized something else too. The cabin held no belongings that belonged to anyone other than her. No spare boots by the door, no men's tools beyond a few worn pieces on the wall, no signs of a second occupant. It raised the question of how long she had been truly alone. When they finished, Ayoko washed the bowls in the basin and set them upside down to dry. Elias stood near the door, unsure whether to speak or walk out. He expected her to look relieved at the thought of him leaving. Instead, she studied the collapsed fence outside, the same broken line he had noticed the day before. The storm had knocked down even more of it. The livestock corral was half open, its far posts leaning like tired men ready to fall over. She exhaled slowly, a subtle sign of worry she rarely showed. "You'll lose animals through that," Elias said. Ayoka kept her gaze on the fence. "There are no animals left to lose." He hesitated. What happened to them? Winter, illness, raiders. Her tone stayed steady, but her fingers tightened slightly on the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "It doesn't matter now. The fence stays because it belonged to him. If I can keep it standing, then the rest of the land won't fall apart." Elias understood the meaning behind her words. She wasn't speaking about wood and hammerwork. She was speaking about holding onto something that tied her to a life she no longer had. The homestead was more than a shelter. It was the last boundary she could still defend. He stepped outside into the wet morning light. The mud clung to his boots as he walked toward the broken fence. Ayoka followed him only far enough to watch. Elias pressed his hand against one of the leaning posts, testing its weight. It shifted dangerously, and he braced it with his shoulder. "You planning to fix that?" she asked. "If that's all right," he said. She didn't answer immediately. Her silence stretched long enough that he wondered if she wanted him gone before the stormwater dried. But then she stepped closer, her expression firm. "If you fix something, do it properly," she said. "Half repairs only fail later." A strange warmth pulled through Elias's chest. Not comfort, not ease, but the sense of being treated as someone capable, not someone to be feared. He found a tool shed behind the house. The door sagged on its hinges, but inside were enough supplies to work with: a rusted saw, a small bucket of nails, rope, and spare wood stacked neatly against the far wall. He chose what he needed and returned to the fence. Ayoka didn't hover. She returned to clearing branches left by the storm, though she kept him within sight. Every so often, she glanced over, as if studying his manner more than his work. Elias repaired the posts, tightening rope where nails wouldn't hold and replacing the boards too damaged to salvage. The rhythm of the work steadied him. Each strike of the hammer pushed aside the restless guilt that usually followed him. He felt an unexpected focus, the kind that came from being useful again instead of drifting. Ayoko approached as he tightened the final support. She looked over the repaired section carefully, checking it the same way she checked every part of her home. "It'll hold for now," Elias said. "You'll need a new post in spring, but this will keep the line standing." She nodded once. "Thank you." Her gratitude wasn't warm or expressive, but it was sincere. That meant more to him than he wanted to admit. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped back. "I could take a look at the roof beam, too, if you want." Ayoka's eyes lifted with a flicker of hesitation. Accepting help meant trusting him beyond the storm, allowing him to stay longer than the weather required. She didn't seem ready to invite that, but she also didn't dismiss him. "Why did you come back out here to work instead of riding away?" she asked. Elias considered the question. He didn't want to offer anything dramatic or sentimental. She wouldn't believe it anyway. The truth was simple. "Leaving didn't feel right," he said. "Not while there's work that needs doing." Her expression softened by the smallest fraction, barely visible but present. He returned to the cabin wall and studied the sagging roof beam from outside. The damage was worse than he realized. If left alone, it would collapse before winter ended. "You can fix that?" Ayoka asked. "With your help," he replied. That answer changed the air between them. It placed them on the same side of the problem, not as host and outsider, but as two people working to keep a place alive. She stepped closer. "Tell me what you need." As they gathered supplies from the shed, Elias noticed a small locked chest beneath a cloth near the back. He hadn't seen it before. Its presence felt different from everything else, protected, intentionally hidden. He didn't ask about it. He simply noted that this home held secrets, and Ayoka guarded them with the same quiet strength she used to guard herself. They spent the next several hours repairing the roof beam. Working side by side revealed a rhythm between them neither had expected. She anticipated which tools he needed before he asked. He adjusted his pace to match hers. Sweat beaded at their temples despite the cold, and muddy water splashed beneath their boots as they moved ladders, boards, and rope. By afternoon, the beam was reinforced, secure enough to last the season. Ayoka stood back and inspected the work. This time, she didn't hide her relief. "You did more than I expected," she said. Elias met her eyes. "You've been doing more than anyone should alone." The words unsettled her, not because she disagreed, but because she wasn't used to being seen that clearly. Before either of them could speak again, Elias's horse raised its head sharply and snorted. The animal stared toward the tree, alert. Ayoka followed the horse's line of sight. Her posture changed instantly, straightening, sharpening, preparing. Not fear, readiness. "There's no one out there," Elias said quietly. "There is always someone out there," she answered. "You just don't always see them." The tension in her voice carried a truth she hadn't shared yet. And Elias felt, for the first time, that whatever she was hiding was not just a part of her past. It was a part of her present. But neither pushed for more. Instead, they walked back toward the cabin, the repaired beam visible behind them, the fence line standing where it had collapsed the night before. For the first time since arriving, Elias didn't think about leaving. And for the first time since losing her husband, Ayoka didn't imagine the land swallowing her whole. The late afternoon light settled over the homestead with a muted, cold stillness. Elias remained near the repaired beam, checking each rope and support one last time. The work had steadied something inside him, but also raised questions he hadn't expected. Questions about why he was still here and why leaving felt less certain than it had that morning. Ayoka stood a few steps behind him, arms folded against the cold. She watched the tree line again, the same direction where the horse had sensed movement earlier. Her eyes stayed narrow, alert, as if she expected a shape to step out of the pines at any moment. Elias wiped his hands and finally asked the question that had formed in his mind since he first saw how carefully she guarded the property. "What made you choose to live this far out?" Ayoka didn't turn toward him, but her posture shifted. She lowered her arms, letting them relax at her sides. "This place belonged to my husband's family," she said. "He wanted to raise our children here, away from the towns, away from people who treated us like we didn't belong." Her voice held a firm steadiness, but there was something fragile beneath it. Elias felt it, and he waited, giving her space to continue if she chose. "He died last winter," she said. "Fever took him fast. Before he went, he asked me not to abandon the land. He believed it protected us." She paused, so I stayed. Elias absorbed the information quietly. Her determination made sense now. The repaired beam, the way she fought to keep the fence upright, the careful order inside the cabin. She wasn't just maintaining a shelter. She was holding the last part of her husband's life together. "What about your family?" he asked. Her gaze hardened just a little. "They visit when they can, but this place is not easy to reach. Some paths are dangerous, especially now." Elias understood the unspoken meaning. She had been isolated far more often than she had been supported. The wind shifted, bringing a colder bite. Ayoka motioned toward the cabin. "We should get inside. The light will drop soon." Inside, the warmth from the stove had returned, spreading gently through the small room. Elias hung his coat near the wall. Careful not to drip water onto the floor, she kept so strictly clean. Ayoka ladled the last of the morning's stew into 2 bowls. She ate standing near the counter while Elias took his seat at the table. He realized she ate this way every day, fast, efficient, without letting herself slow down long enough to feel how alone she had been. "You ever let anyone help before today?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Help costs something. Out here, it usually costs more than I can give." Elias nodded. He knew the truth of that. He had seen men demand payment in ways that forced people into choices they never wanted to make. "I'm not looking for anything," he said quietly. Ayoka didn't reply at first. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for any sign that contradicted his words. Finding none, she returned to her bowl. When they finished eating, she stepped outside to check the sky, leaving the door slightly open so she could hear if anything moved in the house. Elias used the moment to look around the cabin again, trying to understand the life she had lived here. Small details filled in what she hadn't said yet. A stack of children's blankets folded neatly on a high shelf. A wooden rattle tucked behind a pot. A bundle of herbs tied with twine, labeled with symbols he didn't recognize. These items were not leftovers or forgotten objects. They were preserved with intention, protected. Elias felt a pressure in his chest, something that told him there was more to her story than she had shared. Ayoka returned inside, closing the door behind her. Her expression was unreadable, but she seemed calmer than before. The sky was clear now. No movement in the trees. No threat nearing the cabin. "You said you might leave today," she said, "but you haven't prepared your horse." Elias exhaled slowly. He wasn't ready to admit the truth, that every hour spent repairing this place made it harder to walk away. Instead, he said, "I want to check the barn before I go." Ayoka nodded. "I'll go with you. The roof there is weak." They walked together to the barn, boots pressing through damp earth. Inside, dust floated in thin streaks of fading daylight. The structure leaned slightly to the right, its supports warped from last year's heavy snows. Elias studied a cracked beam overhead, then knelt to inspect the foundation. "You can't stay here alone through another winter like this," he said. Ayoka stiffened. "I've managed before." "You survived," Elias replied. "But managing and surviving aren't the same." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Her silence wasn't agreement, but she wasn't rejecting his words either. They walked back toward the cabin slowly. The air smelled of wet pine and distant smoke from neighboring land. Ayoka stopped just short of the porch. "Why did you help today?" she asked. "You could have ridden away as soon as the rain stopped." Elias kept his gaze steady. "Because it didn't feel right to leave you with a roof that might collapse. And because you shouldn't be doing all this alone." Ayoka's breath caught slightly, but she controlled her reaction. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. That answer unsettled her more than she expected. She wasn't used to someone seeing the truth so plainly. She hesitated, then stepped toward the door. "If you want to rest before riding out, "There is space here," she said. "You can stay a little longer." Elias's pulse lifted, not with excitement, but with a grounded sense of purpose. He didn't know how long he would stay, or what he was walking toward, but he knew this. Leaving no longer felt like the right choice. The cabin door closed behind them as the light faded. For the first time, the homestead felt less like a place falling apart, and more like a place beginning to hold them both. Night settled over the homestead with a stillness that made even small sounds stand out. The shift of the roof, the soft crackle of the fire, the faint rustle of pine branches outside. Elias sat near the table, oil lamp glowing beside him, checking the handle of his saddlebag. He wasn't preparing to leave, but the habit of readying gear calmed him when his thoughts grew too heavy. Ayoka moved quietly around the cabin, extinguishing the lantern near the stove, folding a blanket, adjusting the latch on the window. Her movements were steady, but the air between them carried something new, an uncertainty neither had addressed directly. She had allowed him to stay longer. He had accepted without hesitation. Now the question lingered. What came next? Elias looked toward a narrow shelf, where he had earlier noticed the children's items, blankets, a small rattle, a carved necklace. The objects were carefully kept, not discarded. They suggested a part of her life she had not chosen to share yet. He didn't want to pry, but the thought stayed with him. If she lost more than just her husband, how has she carried all of this alone? Who was meant to use those things? Ayoka placed another log on the fire. The light brushed across her face, revealing a moment of hesitation before she sat at the opposite end of the table. She held a small piece of wood in her hand, a carved bird with a broken wing. Elias had not seen it before. She turned it once between her fingers, then set it carefully on the table. "You saw the blankets earlier," she said. Her tone was quiet, not defensive, but prepared. Elias kept his posture open. "I did." She looked down at the tiny carving, running her thumb along its smooth surface. "There is something I should tell you. Something I have not spoken of since last winter." Elias waited. She wasn't a woman who spoke without reason. "My husband and I had a child," she said. "A boy." Elias felt his chest tighten, not from surprise, but from the weight she carried in her voice. "He is not dead," she continued. "But he is not here." A silent question formed in his mind, though he didn't voice it. She answered anyway. "Talon lives with my husband's relatives in the mountains. Raiders threatened our village 2 years ago. After that, the elders decided the children would be safer if they stayed hidden with families deeper in the high country." She paused. I agreed. I had no choice. Her voice remained controlled, but Elias saw the strain in her expression, the quiet, persistent grief of a mother forced to protect her child by keeping him far away. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you see him often?" "Not often enough," she said. "The paths are dangerous, and I am alone. If something happened to me on the way, Talon would lose the only parent he has left." Elias absorbed the truth carefully. The locked chest, the children's blankets, the distant watchfulness in her eyes whenever the forest grew too quiet. All of it made sense now. Ayoka looked toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it. "I kept this place ready for him," she said softly, "for when it is safe again." The admission carried a weight that settled deep in the room. Elias felt it in himself too. He realized that the life she was trying to hold together was not only about honoring her husband, it was about giving her son a home to return to. "Does he know about me?" Elias asked. "No," she said immediately. "And he won't." "Not yet." Elias nodded. He understood her caution. Introducing a stranger into a child's life, especially after everything she had endured, required trust she did not yet feel comfortable giving. The fire crackled again, filling a long pause between them. The silence wasn't hostile or distant. It was thick with the truth she had finally spoken and the uncertainty of what it meant for the days ahead. Ayoka reached for the carved bird again. "Talon made this with his uncle last spring. He gave it to me when I left." She held it up to the light. "He said I should keep it because the wing was broken and broken things needed someone to look after them." The simple honesty in her words hit Elias harder than he expected. He felt a deep pull, empathy, understanding, and something closer to responsibility. You're not broken, Elias said. The words came out low but firm. Ayoka looked at him briefly, not startled, but taken aback by the certainty in his tone. Elias continued, "You've kept this place standing when most people would have walked away. That takes strength." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something softened in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might lead to it. "You say that," she murmured, "but you don't know everything." "Then tell me what you want me to know," he replied. Ayoka inhaled slowly, then set the carved bird aside. She seemed to weigh his request, balancing caution against the relief of finally speaking truths she had carried in silence. "There were men who came through here last year," she said. "They were looking for supplies. They wanted more than that." She paused, steadying her voice. "My husband was too weak to defend us. I hid Talon and sent word to the mountains. After that, I stayed here to make sure those men never found him." Elias felt a hard knot form in his chest. "Are they still a threat?" "Not now," she said. "But danger does not always warn you. That is why I watch the trees." Her vigilance, her readiness, her solitude, it all became clear. She wasn't living on this land by accident. She was guarding it, guarding the last safe place her son had. Elias exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have to do all this alone." Ayoka didn't answer immediately. The fire reflected in her eyes as she studied him, measuring not his words, but the steadiness behind them. "You'll be leaving soon," she said. "I don't know that I will," Elias replied. The truth settled between them, heavier than the storm outside had ever been. Ayoka lowered her gaze, not rejecting his words, but struggling with what it meant to let someone remain close enough to matter. Elias spoke again, quieter this time. "If you want me gone, I'll go. But if you want help, if you want someone who'll stay until your boy comes home, I can do that." Ayoka's breath caught in a way she tried to hide. She looked toward the window, gathering herself before she answered. "I don't know what I want yet," she said. Her uncertainty wasn't weakness. It was honesty, earned by hardship, shaped by survival. Elias stood slowly, giving her space. "That's all right." She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The fire dimmed, the night deepened, and the distance between them narrowed in a quiet, careful way neither of them had planned. For the first time, Ayoka didn't feel like she was defending the homestead alone, and Elias no longer felt like a man drifting between places with no reason to stay. Outside, the mountains stood dark and distant, holding the boy who would soon change everything. The next morning arrived without wind, without rain, without the usual signs that the land was preparing to test them again. The silence felt heavier than the storm, not threatening, but expectant. Elias stepped outside to saddle his horse. Though he moved slowly, aware that each decision he made now carried weight he could no longer ignore. Ayoka was already in the yard, gathering small branches left behind by the wind. Her movements stayed controlled, but she was quieter than usual, keeping her thoughts close. The moment she decided to reveal her son's existence had shifted something between them, and now both were navigating the space shaped by truths that could not be taken back. Elias walked toward the fence to check yesterday's repairs. The boards held firm under his weight. He tested the posts, tightening one of the ropes. The familiarity of the work steadied him, but it didn't settle the heaviness in his chest. Ayoka approached with an armful of wood. "You don't have to do that this morning," she said. "I know," Elias answered, "but I want to leave it strong." She hesitated, watching him longer than she meant to. "You're leaving today, then?" He straightened slowly. "Is that what you want?" Her eyes lowered. "I don't want you to stay out of pity. This land isn't a place for someone running from their own past." Elias nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. "I'm not running anymore." Ayoka studied him carefully, searching for signs of uncertainty or hidden motives. She found none. What unsettled her was the steadiness she did find. Letting a stranger stay was dangerous. Letting a man with sincerity stay was something entirely different, something she didn't yet know how to carry. "You said last night that you could stay until my son comes home," she said. "But you don't know how long that might be." "I know," Elias replied. And you don't know him, she added softly. You don't know if he'll accept you. That's his decision to make, Elias said. But I won't avoid him because I'm unsure. Ayoka's breath tightened. She hadn't expected that answer. She had expected hesitation, or a retreat, or the careful distancing most people used when responsibility stepped too close. But Elias spoke like a man ready to take on the hardest parts of her life without being asked. The honesty unsettled her because she didn't know whether to trust it. Why, she asked. Why would you offer that to someone you barely know? Elias leaned against the fence post, the truth sharp and straightforward. Because I know what it's like to lose people, and I know what it's like to need someone and not have them stay. Ayoka's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from recognition. She understood that feeling too well. They stood in silence for a long moment, the chilly air settling around them. Elias considered his next words carefully. What do you want me to do? He asked. Not what you think you should say, what you truly want. She looked away toward the distant mountain ridge where her son lived, the line of peaks half covered in morning haze. I want Talon to have a home to return to, she said finally. A home that doesn't collapse around him. A home where he doesn't see me struggling to keep it standing. Elias felt the meaning in her words. A mother's fear, a woman's exhaustion, a human being stretched thin by too many winters alone. You've kept it standing, Elias said, but it doesn't have to stay that way. Her eyes lifted to his, conflicted, hopeful, cautious. He stepped closer without crowding her. If you want me to stay and help, I will. If you want me gone, say the word and I'll saddle up. Ayoka didn't speak immediately. She looked at his hands, calloused, steady, then at the repaired fence, then at the cabin behind them. Her expression softened and tightened at the same time, as if she were weighing more than one kind of fear. I'm afraid of needing help, she said at last, because needing help means losing something if it disappears again. Elias understood better than she realized. Then don't decide today, he said. Let it come slowly. She exhaled, relieved by the lack of pressure. You can stay for now, she said quietly, but only if you accept that I'm trying to protect what little my son has left. Elias nodded. I understand. Ayoka wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice low and steady. If you stay, you'll be part of this place. You'll be seen as such by him. That means responsibility. That means honesty. That means consistency. Elias met her eyes with the same steadiness he'd shown since he arrived. Then that's what I'll give. The statement changed the air between them. It grounded something, set a foundation, marked a shift neither could ignore. Ayoka finally looked away and motioned toward the barn. There's more to do if we're preparing for winter. Elias followed her, ready to work. They moved in a quiet rhythm, lifting old boards, clearing debris, reinforcing weak posts, each task weaving them gradually into the same purpose. By midday, the barn stood more stable than it had in years. Ayoka watched Elias tie the final support and gave a small, approving nod. You're good at this, she said. He shrugged lightly. It helps me think. What are you thinking about? She asked, surprising herself with the question. How to make this place safe enough for your son, he said, and what it'll take for him to feel at home here again. Ayoka's breath caught. She swallowed the emotion that threatened to rise and used as someone sharing her mission so plainly. As the sun dropped lower, the shadowed ridge of the mountains drew her gaze again. For the first time, the distance didn't feel unbearable. Elias followed her look, but didn't comment. She spoke first. When the pass is open, I will bring Talon home for a visit. Elias nodded. And I'll be here. Ayoka held that answer quietly for a moment, then turned back toward the house. We should finish before the cold sets in. They returned to the cabin side by side. No longer strangers trapped by a storm, but two people beginning a quiet, tentative partnership built on shared burdens, unspoken trust, and the fragile beginnings of something that might hold through winter. The morning brought colder air and a thin crust of frost that covered the ground like a reminder that winter was closer than either of them wanted to admit. Elias stepped outside first, checking the sky, the edges of the property, and the cracks in the frost where animals had passed during the night. The land felt quiet but not empty. It felt as though the world was waiting for their next move. Ayoka emerged shortly after, wrapped in a thicker shawl. She studied the mountains with a calm, steady gaze. The ridge where her son lived was coated in early snow, the higher peaks hidden behind pale clouds. She didn't speak, but Elias could feel the weight of her thoughts, distance, risk, and the hope she had kept buried for months. Traveling to the mountains will get harder soon, Elias said. If you want to bring Talon home for a visit before the deep snows come, we need to leave within days. Ayoka lowered her gaze to the frozen ground. I know. Her voice trembled only slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what she was about to do. She had spent a year preparing the homestead for his return, repairing walls, preserving food, keeping the land alive through loneliness. Yet now, with the chance finally near, uncertainty took hold. Are you ready? Elias asked quietly. She drew a deep breath. I've been ready for a long time. I'm only afraid of doing it alone. You won't be alone, he said. Her shoulders eased, though she didn't look at him. Acceptance came slowly to her, but it was there. They spent the day preparing for the journey, packing dried meat, filling water skins, checking Elias's horse and her sturdy mule. Elias reinforced the cinches, adjusted the packs, and tested the terrain outside the property to see how much snow the trails had caught. Ayoka gathered herbs, blankets, and small offerings for her relatives who had been caring for Talon. She moved with purpose, but her silence revealed how much the trip meant to her. As they worked, Elias noticed a single question lingering between them, unanswered since the night she had spoken about her son. What will Talon think of me? He didn't voice it, not because he feared the answer, but because he respected that the boy's acceptance would take time. Instead, he prepared himself for the journey with calm focus. Whatever Talon decided, Elias knew he had chosen his path already. He would not step away from this family, even if the boy hesitated. By late afternoon, they led the animals toward the forest trail. The wind had grown sharper, cutting through branches and scattering loose needles across the ground. The path curved upward, narrowing between tall pines that blocked most of the light. Ayoka walked ahead, her posture rigid with concentration. Elias stayed close behind, scanning the woods for movement. The earlier comment about raiders echoed faintly in his mind. Though she said the danger had passed, he understood that threats in the frontier never vanished completely. They simply went quiet. Their pace remained steady for several hours. When the elevation finally shifted, Ayoka stopped and pointed ahead. There's a small ridge we must cross. After that, the path splits. One side leads to a winter camp, the other to the place where Talon stays. Elias examined the ridge, steep, narrow, covered in frosted rock. We'll take it slow, he said. They climbed carefully, guiding the horse and mule step by step. The trail grew slick in places, forcing Elias to brace the horse's shoulder and Ayoka to dig her boots into the ground. At the top, the world opened slightly. The valley beyond was wider, layered with small fires from distant encampments. Smoke rose in thin columns, barely visible in the fading light. Ayoka paused. My husband's relatives live past the far ridge. We'll reach them before nightfall. Her voice carried relief mixed with fear that Talon might not recognize her at first, fear that he might see Elias and feel threatened, fear of bringing a man into a world shaped by caution and cultural boundaries. Elias sensed all of it. Whatever happens, let him choose how close he wants to get, he said. We'll go at his pace. Ayoka nodded, slow, grateful, protective. They continued until the sound of distant voices reached them. A small group of huts sat near the tree-line, smoke rising from a central fire pit. Children played near the flames, bundled against the cold, while 3 adults tended to drying racks of meat and herbs. When the adults noticed Ayoka, their faces changed. First surprise, then recognition, then a warm seriousness reserved for someone who had carried too much alone. One of them called out toward a hut. A boy stepped into the doorway. Talon. He was smaller than Elias expected, with long hair tied at the back and dark eyes sharp with both curiosity and caution. He didn't run forward or speak. He simply watched. Ayoka froze. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly. For a moment, the weight of a year apart pressed so heavily on her that she couldn't step forward. Elias touched her elbow gently. "Go to him," he whispered. She took a single step. Talon came closer, slow and wary. When he reached her, he didn't embrace her immediately. He studied her face, searching for something familiar. Then his expression softened and he leaned into her chest, gripping her shawl with small, cold hands. Ayoka closed her eyes and held him tightly, relief, love, and longing all tightening around her at once. Elias stepped back, giving them space. He felt something in his chest ease, not because Talon had accepted him, but because the boy had returned to the person who needed him most. After a long moment, Talon looked past his mother and stared at Elias. The boy's eyes narrowed, not threatened but evaluating. Elias stayed still, hands loose, posture relaxed. Ayoka pulled her son closer. "This is Elias," she said gently. "He is a friend. He helped keep our home standing." Talon didn't respond. He stepped behind his mother slightly, still watching Elias with quiet caution. Elias offered a small nod, but didn't try to approach. Trust had to be earned slowly, and Elias respected that. One of the relatives stepped forward and welcomed them inside for food and warmth. Ayoka guided Talon toward the fire. The boy stayed at her side, not letting go of her hand. As they sat, Elias took a place near the door, close enough to be part of the gathering, but far enough not to overwhelm the child. Ayoka watched Talon eat, her eyes soft in a way Elias hadn't seen before. A mother relieved, a woman no longer carrying everything alone. When Talon finished, he walked to a small wooden chest near the bed. He pulled out a carved toy, a bird with a broken wing. He held it for a moment, then glanced toward Elias before quickly returning to his mother's lap. Elias understood. The child had noticed the carving on their table at home. He hadn't forgotten. The room grew warm from a fire. Voices softened. The night settled in. Ayoka finally turned toward Elias. "We will leave in the morning," she said quietly. "Talon will come home with us." Elias nodded once, steady and sure. Across the room, the boy watched him carefully, curious but no longer hiding. Tomorrow would begin the hardest part of the journey, not because of the terrain, but because this was the first step toward building a family none of them had fully imagined. Dawn rose slowly over the mountain encampment, lighting the frost-covered ground with a pale, sharp glow. Smoke drifted in thin lines from cooking fires, and the distant sound of a drumbeat echoed faintly through the valley, someone marking the start of a new day. Elias stepped outside the hut, tightening his coat against the cold as he checked the animals. His movements were calm, but his awareness stayed sharp. He knew the journey back would be harder with a child and winter closing in. Ayoka emerged a few minutes later with Talon close beside her. The boy held her shawl with one hand, his small fingers gripping the fabric tightly. His eyes were alert, scanning everything around him before settling briefly on Elias. The caution remained, but the hostility Elias had expected never appeared. Talon was wary, not frightened. One of Ayoka's relatives approached with a bundle of supplies: dried meat, herbs, a wool blanket, and a small leather pouch of crushed roots meant for treating cold weather sickness. Ayoka accepted them with both hands, and the woman touched her forehead gently to Ayoka's in a gesture of respect and farewell. "Bring him home safely," the woman said. Ayoka nodded. "I will." Elias secured the supplies to the mule, while Talon watched from behind his mother, studying every step. Elias worked slowly, letting the boy see what he did, careful not to move too quickly or turn his back too soon. He didn't try to speak to him. He knew trust would grow only through consistency, not through forced conversation. When they were ready to begin the journey, Ayoka knelt in front of her son. "Stay close to me," she said gently, "and listen to what I say on the trail." Talon nodded, his expression serious. He clutched the broken-winged bird carving in his hands, a small, worn piece of home he refused to leave behind. They set out as the sun cleared the ridge. The first stretch of the trail descended through tight pines, the ground slick with frost. Elias walked ahead, guiding the horse, while Ayoka kept Talon close behind him. The boy stepped carefully, mimicking his mother's movements. When the path narrowed around a rock outcrop, Talon hesitated. Ayoka placed her hand on his back. "You can do this," she said softly. Talon looked at Elias before taking the step. Elias didn't speak, but he slowed his pace enough to make room for the boy behind him. Talon seemed to notice the small gesture. His expression didn't change, but he didn't hesitate again. Hours passed with steady progress. Cold wind cut through the trees, and the slope grew steeper. When they reached a bend where the trail opened to a ledge, Elias motioned for a rest. Talon sank onto a rock beside his mother, breathing hard. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, but his eyes were bright, alert, absorbing everything. Ayoka handed him a piece of dried fruit. The boy took it, then glanced at Elias again, longer this time, as if evaluating him on a deeper level. Elias sat a short distance away, giving them space but remaining close enough to be relied on. Talon lifted the carving in his small hand and compared it briefly to Elias's face, as though checking whether the man in front of him matched the stories his mother might have told. Ayoka noticed the exchange, but said nothing. She watched her son, not Elias, measuring how the boy was adjusting to the unfamiliar presence beside them. When they resumed walking, the terrain shifted downward into softer soil. Pine needles cushioned their steps, and Talon began moving more confidently. At one point, he walked slightly ahead of his mother, stopping only when the mule shook its pack and startled him. He stepped back quickly, but Elias steadied the animal. "It's all right," Elias said, keeping his voice low and even. "He's just adjusting to the weight." Talon studied him again, cautious, curious, and finally gave a small nod. The first acknowledgement. They continued until the trees thinned and the valley leading home appeared below. The sight of open land brought a subtle change in Ayoka's posture, relief mixed with apprehension. Bringing Talon home was everything she had worked for, but now the boy would see the life she had struggled to maintain alone. As they approached the homestead, Talon slowed. The cabin looked small from a distance, the fence line narrow, the yard uneven. It wasn't fear in his expression, it was evaluation. He was measuring the place where he would sleep, play, and live. When they reached the yard, Ayoka crouched beside him. "This is our home," she said quietly. Talon didn't answer. He stepped forward on his own and touched the repaired fence. His fingers traced the rope Elias had used to reinforce the post. Then he turned toward the cabin and glanced at Elias. Elias held his gaze, steady and patient. Ayoka unlocked the door. Warmth from the preserved fire greeted them. Talon stepped inside slowly, exploring each corner with deliberate movements. His eyes paused on the blankets, the carved rattle, the small items she had kept for him. He touched them carefully, as though afraid they would break under his hand. Ayoka watched with a tremor in her breath. She wasn't afraid of his reaction. She was overwhelmed by the moment she had waited for through months of solitude. When Talon finished looking, he walked to the table and placed the broken-winged bird carving in the center. He kept his hand on it, steady and sure. Then, without turning, he asked softly, "Will he stay?" Ayoka froze. The boy looked at his mother, not Elias. His expression was serious, guarded but hopeful. Hope buried beneath caution, hope shaped by a child's instinct for stability. Ayoka looked at Elias, and Elias met her gaze without hesitation. "If you want me here," Elias said quietly, "I will stay." Talon studied him for a long, careful moment. Then he stepped toward Elias, stopping only a few feet away. He didn't reach out, didn't speak further, but he didn't hide behind his mother either. It was the first sign of trust. The following days moved with a steady rhythm. Elias repairing the barn roof, Ayoka preparing winter stores, Talon following both of them with quiet curiosity. His footsteps remained light, his questions sparse, but his presence filled the homestead with something that had been missing for a long time: the sound of a returning family. One afternoon, while Elias hammered a new board onto the barn wall, Talon approached him carrying a small piece of wood. He held it out without speaking. A tiny carving, unfinished, roughly shaped, waiting for hands more skilled than his. Elias accepted it carefully. You want to finish it together? He asked. Talon gave one short nod. Ayoko watched from the doorway, the sunlight catching the edges of her shawl. Her eyes softened in a way she rarely allowed. Her heart tightened, not with fear this time, but with the slow, cautious realization that the family she thought she had lost was forming again, piece by piece, in the most unexpected way. Winter was coming, but the homestead no longer felt fragile. And for the first time, the three of them stood on the same ground with the same quiet hope for what awaited them next. Winter arrived quietly at first, settling over the land in a thin layer of white that softened the edges of the homestead. Smoke curled steadily from the cabin chimney, and the repairs Elias had made held strong against the biting wind. Inside, warmth spread through the rooms, carrying the steady rhythm of a household that finally had more than work and silence to fill its days. Talon adjusted to his new home faster than either adult expected. He stayed close to Yoka during the first days, following her from the stove to the wash basin to the shelves where herbs were kept. But each time Elias stepped outside to work, the boy's attention drifted toward him. He watched the cowboy split wood, repair hinges, and tighten beams with quiet observation. Eventually, he began standing beside him, handing over tools without being asked. The slow but consistent bond forming between them eased one of the largest unspoken questions, whether Talon would accept Elias's presence. The boy didn't speak much, but his actions formed an answer that neither Elias nor Ayoka took for granted. One morning, after the first heavy snowfall, Elias and Talon walked the fence line together. The cold reddened the boy's cheeks, but he moved with a determined energy, eager to match Elias's pace. Elias showed him how to test the strength of the posts and how to spot sections damaged by frost. Talon repeated each step carefully, his small hands pressing against the wood exactly as Elias had done. "You're good at this," Elias said, keeping his tone even but warm. Talon looked up, then nodded, a simple gesture, but one that carried quiet pride. Ayoka watched them from the cabin doorway, wrapped in her shawl. The sight of her son walking beside Elias, shoulder to shoulder, learning, trusting, stirred something deep within her. Relief, gratitude, and a sense of safety she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months blended into one. When they returned to the cabin, Talon tugged on Elias's coat and motioned toward the table. He brought out the unfinished carving he had given Elias before, the small piece of which shaped into the beginning of a bird. Without a word, Talon placed a small carving tool beside it. Elias understood immediately. They sat together at the table, Talon watching every careful movement as Elias shaped the wood with slow, deliberate cuts, showing him how to guide the blade, how to steady his fingers, how to turn the figure without breaking it. Ayoka cooked nearby, the scent of venison stew filling the air. The quiet joy of a home finally shared settled into the room. Later that evening, with a lantern casting soft light around them, Elias finished the carving and handed it back to Talon. The bird, this one with wings whole, rested easily in the boy's palm. Talon stared at it for a long moment, then stepped closer and placed it in Elias's hand instead. A gift returned. Ayoka's breath caught. Talon wasn't simply accepting Elias. He was choosing him. The days that followed brought more proof. Talon began sitting beside Elias at meals, imitating the way he held his spoon. He helped feed the animals, learned to tie small knots, and even smiled once, quickly, shyly, when Elias lifted him to reach a high shelf. Ayoka felt her heart lighten with each passing day, though she kept her emotions contained. She had lived too long in fear of loss to fully trust what she felt. And yet, each time she saw her son safe between them, the edges of her grief softened. One evening, as snow drifted quietly past the window, Ayoka stepped outside to gather firewood. Elias followed her a moment later, brushing the snow from his coat. The cold air stung lightly, but the quiet felt peaceful rather than harsh. "Everything all right?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Yes, I was just thinking." Elias waited, allowing her the space she needed. Ayoka turned toward him, her expression steady but open. When my husband died, I didn't think I would ever share this place with anyone again. I didn't think it was possible to trust someone enough. She paused, her breath forming a thin cloud in the cold. But you've given Talon a reason to feel safe here. And you've given me room to breathe again. Elias didn't speak right away. He stepped closer, careful and calm. This place, it feels like home now. Not because of the land or the cabin. Because of the two of you. Ayoka felt her chest tighten. Not with fear, but with something she had nearly forgotten how to accept. Hope that didn't carry the threat of loss. Stability that didn't demand silence or distance. Inside, Talon pressed his face to the window, watching them. When he saw Elias look his way, he lifted the carved bird and held it up proudly. Ayoka smiled, small, restrained, but real. Elias returned the smile, softly, before looking back at her. "If you'll have me," he said, "I'll stay. Not just through winter. For as long as you want me here." Ayoka didn't look away. She steadied herself, then nodded once. "Then stay," she said, "not as a visitor, as part of this home." The words settled into the cold air, with a certainty neither of them questioned. They walked back inside together. Talon ran to his mother and then to Elias, holding both their hands with a quiet confidence he hadn't shown before. They gathered around the fire, the warmth filling the cabin, and for the first time since the storm that brought Elias to their door, the homestead no longer felt vulnerable or incomplete. It felt whole. Talon curled against his mother's side while Elias added another log to the fire. The light flickered across the walls, touching every repaired beam, every cherished object, every corner that had once felt too empty. Ayoka rested her hand on her son's head. Elias sat beside them, steady and grounded, finally part of something he wasn't running from. Outside, winter deepened. Inside, a family, quiet, unexpected, and strong, had finally found its place. The story closed not with a question, but with a certainty. They would face whatever came next together.